The house I grew up in was old, far older than any other home in our small town. Its foundation had been laid almost a century earlier, and though my parents did their best to modernize it, there was always one part of the house that resisted: the basement. Unlike the cozy, carpeted spaces I'd see in friends' houses, ours was a cavern of concrete walls, exposed pipes, and a faint smell of damp earth that never fully went away. My mother used it mostly for storage, keeping cardboard boxes stacked along the walls, some so old that their bottoms sagged from moisture. But to me, that basement was more than just unsettling. It felt wrong, as if it harbored something that didn't belong to us. When I was 12, my father gave me the chore of going down there once a week to fetch bottled water from a case he kept against the far wall. I hated it. Each time, I'd pause at the top of the stairs, staring down into that rectangle of shadow, heart already thumping before my foot touched the first step. The wooden staircase creaked under my weight, and I always felt like the sound was announcing me to something waiting below. The bare bulb that dangled from the ceiling gave off a dim yellow glow, but it never seemed to push back the darkness at the edges of the room. I'd grab the water quickly and run back up, sometimes dropping bottles in my panic. It was on one of those trips, late one evening, that I first heard it. My parents had gone to bed, leaving the house silent except for the ticking of the old clock in the living room. I opened the basement door, already bracing myself for the errand, when I heard a soft tapping sound drifting up the stairs. It was faint, irregular, like someone drumming their fingers on the concrete floor. I froze, gripping the railing, straining to hear it again. At first, I thought it might be a pipe settling, but then the tapping stopped and was replaced by something worse: the sound of slow, deliberate breathing. My instinct screamed at me to slam the door shut and run, but a strange pull kept me rooted in place. I leaned forward, trying to make out any movement in the darkness, but the weak bulb swayed slightly, making shadows ripple across the walls. For a fleeting second, I thought I saw something shift behind the farthest row of boxes, just the faintest silhouette of someone crouching low. I stumbled back, slammed the door, and pressed my back against it, heart pounding so loudly I swore it could be heard through the walls. That night, I didn't sleep at all, and the sound of that breathing haunted me with every blink of my eyes. The next morning, when sunlight cut through the house, I tried to convince myself I had imagined it. But the memory lingered, sharp and undeniable. Something had been down there, or maybe it still was. I didn't tell my parents right away, but from that day forward, the basement no longer felt like just a creepy room. It felt inhabited, and I dreaded the next time I'd be forced to open that door. For several weeks after that first night, I refused to go down into the basement alone. I invented excuses, forgot about the water, or begged my younger sister to come with me, though she always refused. My father, unimpressed with what he called my imagination, eventually dragged me down one Saturday morning to prove there was nothing to fear. He flipped the switch, and the weak bulb swayed to life. Dust motes floated in the air like drifting snow, and the room looked exactly as it always had: boxes stacked in uneven towers, an old washing machine tucked against the wall, and pipes running like veins along the ceiling. Nothing moved. My father chuckled, handed me a case of water bottles, and marched back upstairs without a second glance. But even in that short moment, I swore I felt eyes on me. That night, I was woken by a faint, grating sound. At first, I thought it was the house settling or a mouse in the walls, but as I lay in bed holding my breath, the noise sharpened into something deliberate: scratching. It came from below me, beneath the floorboards, right where the basement would be. Long, slow drags, like fingernails across stone. The sound would stop for a few seconds, then start again, closer, as if something was dragging itself along the basement wall directly beneath my room. I buried myself under the blanket, too terrified to move, and prayed for daylight. The following morning, I went downstairs early, hoping to prove to myself that it had been a dream. My mother was in the kitchen, humming as she cooked breakfast, and I thought maybe I had imagined everything after all. But as I passed the basement door, something caught my eye: deep grooves etched into the wood of the frame, right where the door met the wall. They were thin, uneven, and jagged, as if something with claws had been raking at it from the inside. My stomach turned cold. I leaned in closer, brushing my fingertips over the scratches, but quickly pulled away when I realized they were fresh. Bits of wood dust still clung to the edges that I didn't tell my parents. I knew they wouldn't believe me, and I wasn't even sure how to explain it without sounding insane. Instead, I avoided the basement as much as possible, even running past the door whenever I had to go upstairs. But the sounds didn't stop. Some nights it was scratching, other nights it was that slow, measured breathing again, rising up through the floorboards like the house itself was exhaling. Each time, I'd lay awake, rigid with fear, counting the hours until dawn. I started to wonder if I was the only one hearing it, or if it had chosen me, somehow, to notice. One night, however, I realized I wasn't imagining things. I was lying awake, straining to hear the sounds again, when I heard footsteps creak across the floor downstairs. At first, I thought it was my father, but then I realized the steps were too slow, too deliberate, and they stopped directly beneath my room. I sat upright, heart hammering, when suddenly, 3 knocks echoed against the underside of my floor. Perfectly spaced, deliberate knocks. And I knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that whatever was in the basement wanted me to know it was real. I tried to go about life as normal, but the basement's presence seemed to spread through the house like mold. Even during the day, I'd catch myself glancing at the basement door whenever I passed it, expecting it to open on its own. At night, the knocking came back, sometimes one slow rap, sometimes a series of 3, always beneath my bed. My grades slipped because I couldn't sleep, and my mother began to notice the dark circles under my eyes. I wanted to confide in her, to beg her to believe me, but I feared her dismissive laughter more than the thing in the basement. So, I suffered silently, hoping it would lose interest in me if I ignored it. One Friday evening, my parents went out to dinner and left me home alone. My sister was staying at a friend's house, and the quiet felt heavier than usual. I was halfway through a movie when the scratching started again, only this time it was louder, bolder, like whatever was making it knew I was by myself. The sound scraped up the concrete, moved across the basement wall, and then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I muted the TV and sat frozen, ears straining, when I heard it, a dragging sound, like something heavy being shifted across the basement floor. Against every ounce of reason, I found myself walking to the basement door. My hand shook as I turned the knob, opening it just enough to peer down the stairs. The weak bulb swung slightly, though no draft touched me. For a long moment, everything looked still, just rows of boxes, a rusted tool shelf, the washer, the pipes. Then my eyes adjusted, and I saw it. Behind the tallest stack of boxes, just beyond the light's reach, something pale peeked out. At first I thought it was part of the wall, but then it moved. It was a face. Smooth, colorless skin stretched across sharp cheekbones, with eyes so dark they seemed to absorb the dim light around them that I stumbled back, slamming the door so hard a picture frame on the hallway wall rattled. My chest heaved, and my palms stung from gripping the knob too tightly. I didn't dare open it again, not even to lock it, for fear that if I did, I'd see that face staring up at me from the shadows. Instead, I pressed my back to the opposite wall, staring at the door until my parents returned hours later. When they came in, they asked why the TV was still on and why I looked pale as death, but I had no words for them. I just shook my head and said I was tired. That night, as I tried to convince myself it had been a trick of my imagination, I heard the scratching again. But this time, it wasn't beneath the floor. It was coming from the other side of my bedroom wall. And when I pressed my ear against the plaster, I could hear something faint but unmistakable, breathing, slow and steady, like someone waiting for me to fall asleep. Sleep became impossible after that night. Every creak of the house felt amplified, every shadow stretched longer than it should. I kept my bedroom light on until sunrise, too afraid to close my eyes for more than a few minutes. The breathing in the wall returned night after night, always steady, always patient, as if the thing was learning my rhythms. By the end of the week, I was on edge constantly. My friends noticed I'd grown distant, but I couldn't explain the truth without sounding unhinged. Deep down, though, I knew I wasn't imagining any of it. Something in that basement was alive, and it was getting closer. One Saturday, I woke to find the basement door ajar. I was the first one up, and the rest of my family was still asleep. The sight rooted me to the spot. My father always locked it after carrying up boxes, and I hadn't been near it in days. Yet now it stood open just a few inches, enough for the dark air of the basement to spill into the hallway. I forced myself forward, hand trembling as I pushed it shut, then locked it. The knob was cold, unnaturally cold, as if it had been touched by something that didn't belong in this world. Later that evening, my parents hosted a small dinner with neighbors, filling the house with laughter, clinking glasses, and the smell of roast chicken. For a while, the noise drowned out my unease, and I almost felt normal again. But as I carried a stack of plates to the kitchen, I noticed the basement door was ajar once more. Just barely. I froze mid-step, the plates rattling in my hands. Nobody else seemed to notice. Forcing a laugh, I set the dishes down and went to shut it, but when I reached the door, I heard something, a faint whisper rising from the darkness below. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was low, coaxing, like it wanted me to lean closer. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I locked the door myself and dragged a chair across the hallway to wedge under the knob. I thought maybe I'd finally have peace. But around 2 in the morning, a sharp sound jolted me awake. Creak. My bedroom door shuddered in its frame, as though something had pressed against it. I sat up, listening, and then I heard it, slow, dragging footsteps on the hallway carpet. Not my parents, not my sister. These steps were heavy, uneven, as if whatever was walking wasn't used to moving upright. My blood went cold when I realized the chair I'd wedged under the basement door was no longer scraping against the floor. I pulled my blanket to my chin, barely daring to breathe, as the footsteps paused outside my room. A long silence stretched, followed by a sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. 3 slow knocks against my bedroom door. Not on the wood. On the other side, low to the ground, as if something was crouched there, waiting for me to open. I sat frozen, staring at the bedroom door as the knocks echoed in my chest like drumbeats. Each one was slow, deliberate, as though whatever was out there was savoring the moment. My hand hovered near the lamp switch on my nightstand, but I didn't dare turn it off or on. I was terrified the sudden change would provoke it. The silence stretched after the last knock, so thick it roared in my ears. Then, just when I thought maybe it was over, the doorknob twitched. Not a violent rattle like a person might give, but a small, testing turn, as though fingers were delicately feeling how it worked. I leapt out of bed and pressed my shoulder against the door, holding it shut. My breath came in short bursts, and I could feel the cool metal knob shifting against me. Then the footsteps began again, retreating slowly down the hall. I listened as they creaked on the stairs, one step at a time, dragging something heavy along. A faint thump accompanied every other step, as though whatever it was had a limb it couldn't quite lift. When the sound finally reached the basement door, I expected to hear the knob turn, but instead, I heard a wet, guttural sound, halfway between a growl and a laugh. Then silence. The next morning, the chair I'd placed under the basement door was upright again, neatly pressed against the knob as if I had never moved it. My parents swore they hadn't touched it, and my sister wasn't even home that night. I wanted to tell them what I had seen and heard, but I knew they wouldn't believe me. To them, it was impossible. To me, it was undeniable. That thing had left the basement and walked the halls of our home. The breaking point came 2 nights later. I woke in the dark, unsure why, until I heard the sound of fabric rustling at the foot of my bed. My heart pounded as I lifted my head just slightly. In the faint glow from my desk lamp, I saw it, something pale and long-limbed crouched at the end of the mattress, fingers splayed wide, nails scraping lightly against my blanket. Its face was the same one I'd glimpsed behind the basement boxes, stretched, hollow, with deep black eyes that glistened like oil. For a few seconds, we locked eyes, and I felt like I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as though it were holding me in place. Then it tilted its head, and in a voice like dry leaves brushing together, it whispered my name. That was all I needed. I screamed louder than I ever had in my life. My parents rushed into the room within seconds, flicking on the overhead light, but by then, it was gone. No trace on the floor, no marks on the bed, nothing but me sobbing uncontrollably. My father shook me, demanding to know what had happened, but I couldn't explain through the tears. The only thing I could manage to say was, "It came out." The morning after I saw it crouched at the end of my bed, my parents sat me down at the kitchen table. My mother placed a steaming cup of tea in front of me, her face soft with concern, while my father leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his expression harder. They both wanted answers. I tried to explain, the scratches on the basement door, the footsteps, the knocking, the face. But my father shook his head before I even finished. "Nightmares," he said flatly. My mother suggested stress from school. No matter how I pleaded, they refused to accept that something could be in our home. That evening, determined to prove I wasn't losing my mind, I stole my father's old camcorder from the closet. It was bulky and outdated, but it still worked. I set it up on a stack of books across from the basement door, red light blinking as it recorded. My plan was simple: if the door opened on its own, if anything moved, I would have proof. For hours, I sat in the hallway with my back against the wall, watching the shadows stretch as the bulb overhead dimmed with age. Around midnight, exhaustion dragged me under, and I dozed off against my will. When I woke, the camcorder was dead. Not just low on battery, dead, as though it had been drained. I pressed the playback button anyway, heart hammering. The first hour showed nothing but stillness. The second hour, I saw myself dozing off in the corner. But then, around 1:37 a.m., the basement door creaked open on its own. My stomach dropped as I watched it inch wider and wider. Then, the camera picked up something else, a shadow slithering across the floor, long and spindly, pulling itself into the hallway. The figure didn't fully appear, only its silhouette, but it was enough. I saw it crawl toward me, toward the spot where I had been sleeping. Before the footage cut to static that I rewound it 3 times, my hands trembling so badly I almost dropped the camera. It was real. I had proof. I wanted to run to my parents' room immediately, shove the tape into their hands, and scream that I wasn't crazy. But something stopped me. A thought, dark and insidious, that maybe it wanted me to show them. That maybe revealing it would only give it more power over the whole family. My chest tightened as I stared at the frozen screen, the static hissing in the dark. So instead of waking them, I hid the tape beneath my mattress and lay awake until dawn, my eyes fixed on the crack beneath my bedroom door. All night, I swore I saw shadows moving there, stretching too far into the light, as if something waited patiently on the other side. For 2 days, I carried the weight of that tape under my mattress, terrified and desperate at the same time. Every night, the noises grew bolder, the scratching in the walls, the dragging on the basement steps, the faint whisper of my name. I hardly slept, and my mother began hovering near me, worried about my hollow eyes and trembling hands. Finally, one evening, when my father dismissed another of my excuses for avoiding the basement, I snapped. I ran to my room, pulled the tape free, and shoved it into the camcorder. "Watch," I demanded, my voice shaking but firm. "At first, my father scoffed, but my mother leaned in close as the grainy footage began. The basement door stood closed, the hallway still. Then, at 1:37 a.m., it opened slowly on its own. My mother gasped, covering her mouth. My father sat forward, his smirk fading. Then the shadow slid into the frame, long, spindly, crawling low to the ground, stretching unnaturally as though its limbs had no joints. It pulled itself toward the lens, closer, until the image distorted with static. When the tape cut out, the silence in the room was suffocating. My father rewound it twice, jaw clenched, searching for a rational explanation. "A glitch," he muttered, though his voice trembled. My mother shook her head violently. "That wasn't a glitch," she whispered. She looked at me then, eyes wide, and for the first time, I felt the weight of her belief. She believed me. And that was almost worse, because it meant we were no longer safe. That night, my father nailed the basement door shut. He hammered board after board across the frame until the wood splintered. "Whatever it is, it's not coming up here again," he said. His voice carried false confidence, but I could see the sweat on his brow, the way his hands trembled when he set the hammer down. We all slept fitfully, the pounding of nails echoing in our ears long after the work was done, but sometime after midnight, we woke to the sound of those same nails being pulled, one by one, from the wood. Not by a hammer. By hand. The sound of nails being pulled from the wood echoed through the house like a grotesque metronome. One by one, sharp squeals of protest rang out as each nail slid free from the doorframe. We all gathered in the hallway, pale with fear, listening. My father held the hammer like a weapon, his knuckles white, while my mother clutched my sister to her chest. I stood frozen, eyes locked on the basement door. Each creak and groan was another reminder that the barrier between us and it was only temporary. When the final nail gave way, the silence that followed was unbearable. My father slowly stepped forward, raising the hammer as though he could strike whatever came through. The doorknob twitched once, twice, then turned with deliberate slowness. But the door didn't swing open. Instead, something began pressing against it from the other side. The wood bowed inward, boards splintering, as though something impossibly strong was trying to squeeze through. Then, from the gap at the bottom, a hand slid under. Pale, impossibly long fingers curled onto the hallway floor, nails black and jagged, scratching shallow grooves into the wood. My mother screamed. My father lunged forward, slamming the hammer down on the hand. The blow landed with a sickening crack, but instead of recoiling in pain, the hand merely twitched, the fingers flexing unnaturally, bending backward at impossible angles before slipping back under the door. The silence that followed was even worse than the sound of the nails. We all stared at the door, hearts pounding, knowing it hadn't left, only retreated for the moment that we barricaded the hallway that night, dragging furniture into place until the passage was nearly blocked. My father insisted he'd call someone in the morning, a priest, maybe, or at least the police, though what could the police do against something like this? The hours crawled by as we sat together in the living room, the shadows stretching long under the weak light of a single lamp. My sister cried softly into my mother's lap, while my father sat rigid, hammer still in hand. I just stared at the barricade, every nerve in my body on fire, waiting for the next sound, and just before dawn, when exhaustion began to pull me under, it came, a voice, low and rasping, slithering through the silence. It whispered my name again, not from the basement this time, but from behind the living room wall. The whisper faded, but its echo clung to the air like smoke. None of us spoke. We barely breathed. The barricade in the hallway loomed over us, a fragile wall between life and something we couldn't understand. Then, just as the first rays of dawn began to creep through the curtains, the entire house shuddered. A deep, resonant thud shook the floorboards. Then another. It wasn't coming from the basement door anymore. It was moving inside the walls. We scrambled to our feet as the pounding grew louder, circling the room like a predator testing its cage. My father shouted for everyone to stay together, gripping the hammer so tightly his hand bled where the metal bit into his palm. Then the wall behind the television cracked with a sharp snap. A jagged fissure split through the plaster, dust raining down as something pressed from the other side. The wall bulged outward, and before we could react, it gave way with a deafening crash. It crawled through on all fours, pale and spindly, its limbs too long for its body. Its head twisted unnaturally as it squeezed into the room, black eyes gleaming with a hunger that froze me where I stood. The stench of damp earth and rot poured in with it, filling my lungs, choking me. My mother screamed and pulled my sister behind her, while my father swung the hammer with all his strength. The blow landed square on its shoulder, the crunch of bone echoing, but the thing didn't falter. It turned its head slowly toward him, its mouth splitting into an impossible grin, teeth like broken shards of glass. The creature lunged. My father fell hard, the hammer clattering across the floor. My mother grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the front door, but the entity was too fast. It skittered sideways, impossibly quick, blocking the exit with limbs that bent like broken sticks. Its voice filled the room, not a whisper this time, but a guttural chorus that made my stomach churn. "You opened the door," it rasped, the sound vibrating through the walls themselves. For a moment, time seemed to fracture. My father staggered to his feet, clutching his side. My sister sobbed into my mother's arms. And me, I was locked in its gaze, those endless black eyes drilling into me. I realized then that it had always wanted me. The scratching, the knocking, the whispers, it had chosen me from the beginning. And now, with the walls broken and no more barriers, there was nowhere left to hide. The creature held us there, its grotesque body blocking the only exit. My father, bleeding and pale, staggered toward the hammer, but the thing moved with uncanny precision, placing one twisted limb over it. Its eyes never left mine. My name scraped from its throat again, that broken chorus of voices, each syllable dripping with hunger. I felt my body stiffen, as if invisible threads tugged me toward it. My mother gripped me tighter, but even her arms felt distant, powerless against its pull. Then, for the first time since this began, my father did something I'll never forget. He snatched up one of the wooden boards he'd nailed across the basement door earlier and swung it with all his strength. The board splintered against the creature's head, knocking it sideways with a screech like metal tearing. It wasn't enough to kill it, if it could even be killed, but it was enough to buy us seconds. "Run," he bellowed. His voice snapped me out of its hold. We bolted. My mother dragged my sister, and I pulled my father's arm over my shoulder, forcing him toward the front door. The thing scrambled after us, its limbs cracking against the walls, leaving deep gouges in the plaster as it moved. Just as it lunged, my father swung again, knocking it back. My mother wrenched the door open, and we spilled into the cold night air, sprinting barefoot across the lawn. Behind us, the thing slammed into the doorway, its dark eyes burning in the glow of the porch light, but it didn't follow us past the threshold. It just watched. We never went back. My parents packed what little we could carry that night and drove us to my aunt's house 2 towns over. The next day, my father called a contractor to seal the basement permanently, though I don't know if it mattered. We moved within the month. The new family who bought the house never reached out to us, and we never dared to ask. But sometimes, late at night, when I lie awake in the quiet, I swear I can still hear it, the dragging, the scratching, the slow, patient breathing, because I know the truth now. That thing in the basement wasn't just tied to the house. It was tied to me. And deep down, I know it's only a matter of time before it finds its way out again.